Could I have Commissioner Morocco lead us with the salute to the flag?
Sure.
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, item number 2, approval of order of agenda.
Motion to approve?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye, motion approved. Item number 3, additional items for immediate consideration, blue folder items. No blue folder items?
No.
Okay. Item number 4, consent calendar. Sub-bullet point number 4, approval of affidavit of posting for the special budget and finance commission meeting of May 24th, 2018.
Motion approved.
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Motion passes. Item number 5, approval of following minutes of regular meeting of March 8, 2018.
Motion to approve.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All opposed? Motion passes. Item number 5, excluded consent calendar. Nothing. Item number 6, public participation of non-agenda items. This is the time for any audience participation for any non-agenda item. Do I have any participation? None. Moving on to item number 7, old business. No old business.
Oh, I just had I had a note from our March 8th meeting that we would get the detail on any state regulations on how the revenues are reported in the Harbor Enterprise Funds.
We are still waiting for information on that from our city attorney's office.
Okay. Any idea about when?
I keep thinking it's going to be the next month, but I
Okay.
don't have a date.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Okay, new business, item number 8. Review of the fiscal year 2018, 2019 city manager's proposed budget and fiscal year 2018 to 2023 city manager's proposed 5-year capital improvement program. Joe?
Sure. Good evening, commissioners, members of the public. Pursuant to the budget calendar that was adopted by the council earlier this year, this is the first of several public reviews of the proposed budget. Each of you should have gotten a copy of both the operating budget and the capital budget. Shortly after it was made public and released, we got it out about 8 days earlier than we have in the past. So it came out May 8th as opposed to the charter date of May 16th. So tonight we have a PowerPoint presentation going to kind of hit the highlights of both the operating and the capital budget. We will be in front of the City Council on June 6th for the first public hearing. Those public hearings will continue June 12th and then June 19th, at which time we anticipate the budget will be adopted prior to the July 1 start of the fiscal year. So I'm going to cover the first few slides, and then you'll hear from Mr. Wazanski, Assistant City Manager, and Marnie Ruland, who's our Finance Director. So we always start with kind of a brief definition of what the budget process is. This is a definition that we've used for the last few years, establishing funding priorities in accordance with the city's core values and adopted financial principles and strategic plan. You're all aware that we have strategic planning sessions twice a year that really in large part kind of sets the tone for what are the main objectives of the city for each of the next 6-month periods. That's done pursuant to our adopted core values. They're in the budget along with the adopted financial principles. There's several pages that outline what those principles are in your budget, but the core values fiscal responsibility, openness and honesty, integrity, ethics, and accountability, outstanding customer service, teamwork, environmental responsibility, and excellence. These are the values that really guide the work that we do on a day-to-day basis. It's something that whenever we do strategic planning, we review these values with the council, get them to affirm them, and really they do try to guide all of our work. So the organization of the budget, if you've had some time to review it, it's these are kind of the primary components of the budget. You've got on the operating side, you've got the city manager's budget message, the first several pages that provides a kind of a high-level overview of what's happening with our revenues, our expenditures. Throughout each of the departmental budgets, you have what's referred to as the core budget. Those are the primary funding categories of personnel, maintenance and operations, internal service fund, charges, and capital outlay. Changes to the budget from one year to the next, either a change in funding or a change in service, are outlined in decision packages. That's a format that we've used for the past several years. We really try to focus on the changes from one year to the next. We have 46 individual decision packages that are recommended. Those are outlined in a listing, and then there's a summary chart at the end that kind of represents the pluses and negatives with regard to the budget. So that's in the past where a lot of the focus has been as part of the public hearings, but everything's on the table. We don't have to just focus on the decision packages, but that's kind of where a lot of times we start in terms of the public hearings and the public review. Budget response reports provide supplemental information. We've included in your packet tonight the listing of the reports that we're working on. We don't have them done. We'll have many of them in front of the council June 6th. We took the list of proposed questions to the council at their last meeting. They reviewed those, made some changes. In fact, there were some suggestions for budget response reports that were made as part of our strategic planning session. So think of budget response reports as kind of more fully describing certain budget challenges, some analysis, some explanation, really trying to help tell the story of what we're dealing with as part of the annual budget. So we're going to get into much more detail, but this is the same slide that was presented to the City Council at their recent meeting where they received the budget response report listings. You've got the general fund budget, the core budget, that's $91 million. You've got separate and apart from that the CIP budget that funds capital projects, both new projects as well as continuing projects. Mr. Wiesanski will talk more about that in a few slides. We've got our 1 month general fund reserve, $7.6 million. We've never really touched that. We have a number of different reserves for equipment replacement, for computer technology, a PERS reserve. There's a variety of different separate reserves that we have, but in terms of for our accounting purposes, our general fund contingency is that $7.6 million. 442 full-time employees, that's our full-time staffing. We have about that many part-time employees spread through the different departments, primarily community services and library departments. Community services primarily during the summer months, they staff up. So what you see here at the bottom is you can see really just sort of how tenuously we are balanced in terms of the budget. Before decision packages, we are not balanced. We have revenues that are less than our expenditures, but after the decision packages, we come into balance. The decision packages have adjustments to the budget both up and down. There are some proposed revenues that will be part of a public hearing in front of the council June 19th. There are positions that we are deleting as part of this budget. There's positions that we're holding open. There's reductions to the budget. So it's probably the tightest, well, not probably, it is the tightest budget that the city's had in a number of years. So we are kind of balanced to the dollar with all of those decision packages adopted. So in terms of the budget message, I won't go into a lot of detail on that, but one of the themes of the message is that we've got a convergence of a couple of realities. One is that we've got limited revenue growth in terms of our revenues increasing. We're not seeing major increases in property tax, sales tax, TOT, as we're recommending it be held constant, not going up at all. Why is that? It's because, unlike in some past years, we don't have any new hotels coming online in the coming fiscal year. We don't have any new development that's going to generate significant sales tax in the coming year. We are projecting a slight increase in property tax based on recommendations from our separate consultant that helps advise us, HDL. They're kind of the premier both property tax and sales tax consultant that cities use. So you will see some increase both in terms of property tax as well as sales tax in this budget. So the other reality that we're dealing with are higher pension costs, higher liability costs, and higher workers' compensation costs. We addressed really two of those three things at mid-year when we were in front of the council. We made significant mid-year adjustments dealing with higher liability and workers' comp costs. Those are not one-time adjustments to the budget, but ongoing adjustments to the budget. So we have those continuing higher costs reflected in the budget before you going forward for 18-19. But what's new is accounting for the higher pension costs, and we'll get into that a little bit more. But we've got $2 million more of higher pension costs compared to the prior year. This isn't a result of an increase in benefits. It's not a result of people being granted benefits different or increase from what they have now, or being driven by wage increases. It's just the ongoing cost increases that we're dealing with from PERS. Those rates are set by the Public Employees Retirement System that we're part of. It's not because we have any extraordinarily high benefits. We don't participate in LA City's DROP program where people can retire, collect a pension, and keep working. So we don't have benefits along those lines. So these are some of the drivers of our budget for the coming year.
If I could step in for a second.
Sure.
Keeping this at the 30,000-foot level before we dive into the detail. My fourth year on the commission, I think the briefing would be the same every year. Limited growth in revenue, $1 million increase in workers' comp liability, and multi-million-dollar increase in pension costs. That probably we could go back, and it's the same thing in every briefing for the past 4 years. So now, keeping it at the top level, what are we doing to look forward and through internal resources or the use of, and perhaps we can't, hire an actuary to gaze into the crystal ball of CalPERS and figure out what, not the end game is, but what's our 3 and our 5 year strategy? Because at this pace, our costs are going to be $100 million in 3 years, and our revenues will still be $92 million. So what happens in 3 years?
So that is one of the budget response reports that we do. We don't just look 1 year ahead, we look several years ahead, and that's based on projections from PERS. We also have our own separate analysis that we do. The PERS numbers that we get in future years are projections. They take into account the age of our workforce, the anticipated yield on their returns, the overall state of the economy. That's the best available information. So what we have done in recent years is begin setting aside money in a separate PERS reserve. That's something that we've done for the past several years. So we haven't just been sitting on our hands. We've been proactively trying to plan for this. It's not a surprise.
But it's not going to end either. So, and by the way, I understand that, you can't control what PERS is charging you or the climate in which the workers' comp claims continue to escalate. But, you know, as far as responsibility from the city's point of view, you know, we have a reserve. How long is that going to last?
Well, the reserve will last as long as
it lasts.
we don't rate it. We've got the least amount that we're taking out of that reserve in the coming year. There's been years past where we've taken 2 and 3 times the amount that we're taking out of the reserve. This year, it's $275,000 that we're taking out of that $6+ million reserve. So, you know, this is all in part driven by the number of full-time employees that we have. We do rely heavily on part-time employees to complete work. The most controllable costs that the city has are the number of employees that we have. So we do look at what services we provide with our own employees, what services we contract out, what services maybe don't need to be provided, because at a certain point, you know, we've done, I think, a good job of keeping the level of service high and managing these costs. But you're correct. If they keep spiraling up, there is going to potentially be an effect on services.
And that is my point, is that continuing the trend that, you know, we're not seeing, it's the current year area of concern, the pension obligation and the continual, you know, $1 million decision package for liability issues. It seems obvious that the question that'll be asked in the coming years is, what community services are we going to cut to fund those 2 items? And I'm not going to press you on that, because perhaps it's out of our control, but.
Well, and it's also, you know, it's driven by the direction of the city council. What are the services that are most important to the mayor and city council? What are the services that we want to keep high? What are the services that we may want to reduce if it gets to the point where we're not in balance? I mean, we are in balance with the presentation of this budget, but yeah, I appreciate the comments and the observation, because yes, without some either new revenue sources or expenditure reductions or modifications, I mean, something's going to have to change in order for us to be in balance in future years.
And we can and we will go over the budget line by line and wonder where we can cut $50,000. But you know, what we saw in 2 meetings ago is we've got an increase for the year of $150,000 in revenues and a couple $1 million in pension increases and $1 million in liabilities increases. And it's just dwarfing everything else. And Commissioner, you said you had a comment?
I was going to add, if I could, one point to this conversation. I think one of the things you don't see in this budget is a recommendation for additional funding for cost of living adjustments. So I think to your original question, one of the strategies that we have to use, because it really comes down to affordability, is basically diverting whatever little revenue growth we have that used to be used to increase salaries for our employees now is being diverted to benefits. And when you look at a $2 million or $1.9 million benefit increase effectively, not that the benefits have grown, as Joe mentioned, but our costs have, that becomes the trade-off. So it may be that for several years we're not able to afford cost of living adjustments, and because what would otherwise be a cost of living adjustment is being provided to the employees through assurance that our pension obligations are being met. So that candidly is a strategy we really don't have much of a choice but to deploy, because we have those commitments.
And I appreciate the answers, and obviously I don't hold the 2 of you personally accountable for this. It is a state and a nationwide problem. But I don't want to say, okay, we're balancing this budget on, you know, the edge of a dime and saying, we made it, because that's not the case. It's the, you know, it's the near term that's really going to be more difficult.
I would suggest that there is another line of resource to explore when you're addressing personnel costs. And since we're talking about it, I'll just bring it up now, and that is automation. And that is like things like we did last year, where we created the leasing software in the waterfront. There are companies out there, out-of-the-box solutions, where, for example, you've got, what was it? You could use outside vendors for plan check, but an automated planning system. And there are companies out there that provide that, which helps you reduce the time and effort for people coming down to City Hall in order to apply for a permit when you have a system that you can plan out for through ISF technology charges and eliminate or make more efficient your counter people in the planning department, for example, or the community services for people to have permits for barbecues or new permits for their homes and building construction and things like that. And there are systems like that. Palo Alto, California uses one. Palo Alto, 64,000 people, about the same size as us. So I would suggest that that is another line of resource when we're addressing these personnel issues, in addition to one that you mentioned, Joe, which are all good. And I'll address that later, but I just wanted to mention it now while we were talking about it.
Final comment on this slide is that we've touched on some of the areas of concern. I would be remiss if I didn't touch on some of our positive accomplishments. You know, we were reviewed by the LA County Grand Jury along with all 88 cities in LA County. You don't have to take my word for it that the city has good financial practices. We were ranked number 1 out of 88 cities for our having the best financial practices. You know, that's a pretty significant accomplishment and something we're very proud of. And you know, it's much better to be number 1 than to be number 88. So if anyone thinks that we have anything in common with the cities that make the paper for bad reasons, for financial purposes, that's not us. And I don't want to trash any other cities, but I think we all know the cities that have gotten themselves in trouble with improper accounting and financial practices. That's not us. So we're ranked number 1 by LA County Grand Jury. We had a significant change to our budget in the last year in that we switched risk pools. We left the Independent Cities Risk Management Authority and joined the the State Association of Counties risk pool with significant savings to the city's budget, along with switching from standalone health insurance and moving into CalPERS Health. Both of those, you're seeing savings in the budget because of those 2 actions. So next slide. I think at this point I'm going to turn it over to Marnie.
And this is just a glimpse at our revenue picture for 18-19, with general fund revenues up 2.1% or about 1.9 million. The largest increase comes from property tax, up 3.9%. Our TOT, with the no new hotels coming online, remains flat. Our UUT is one of those that we're actually seeing a decrease in that revenue source. Another high-level picture of our expenditures. Personnel costs are increasing by 3.9%. That, of course, would include our PERS costs, and then it also includes an update to our, we call it OPEB, other post-employment benefits, which is our retiree insurance program. We have a trust fund set up and pay a percentage into that trust fund, and that percentage is one of our personnel costs. M&O, as Joe mentioned, we start with a core budget, and changes to that core budget are done via decision packages. That's our biggest change when you're comparing expenditures to mid-year. A lot of those decision package items, which are one-time appropriations or the transfer from PERS or come year end, we also add in there the carryover appropriations. That comes as our biggest change when you're comparing the mid-year number to our proposed number for 18-19. The internal service fund allocations, those are remaining flat from mid-year because mid-year is the time when we do our update. So we'll do it again mid-year 18-19. The first year of the 5-year CIP program is included as expenditures in the 18-19 budget. And then just overall, our general fund expenditures are down 1.2%. And again, that relates back up to primarily the M&O and the capital outlay.
So Marnie, on the previous slide regarding property tax up 3.9%, and as you know, the property tax for existing homes is typically around 1.25% or so. So is that 2.7%, is that essentially just new builds, essentially?
Yeah, it would be, it's reassessed upon sale,
Right.
Any new, and then the, 2% increases. We still have a tiny bit of the Prop 8 where property owners requested that their property taxes be reduced when their home values were down. We still have a tiny bit of that to still catch up on, but that's almost done.
So essentially, like you said, just sales and then new builds. Have there been a lot of new builds?
Not a lot of new builds, but I think more, I can't remember our exact net unit count. Aaron just had this material presented. I think it's around maybe 100 new units in the community, as I recall, give or take a few. But more, I think, more present is our conversions on resale. We have maybe a longtime homeowner, been in the property for 40, 50 years, decides to downsize or move on to assistive care or the like, and what was a property assessment of appraised value of $150,000 all of a sudden is appraised at $1.5 million or something along those lines, and that new homeowner is paying a much larger property tax bill. So, although difficult for the new homeowner, something we certainly benefit from a city revenue standpoint.
Thank you.
So Marnie, on the other post-retirement benefits, is CalPERS is strictly retirement, or is that health as well?
That's strictly retirement. The post-employment benefits beyond that would be we do have in our benefit structure retirement health if you've worked for the organization for a number of years that lasts or runs through medical Medicaid and
65.
through that age 65. So if you have a firefighter that might depart the city at 50 or 55, we're picking up a portion of their premium cost for approximately 10 years. So that benefit is ultimately one of a few that are in that category.
Okay, thank you.
So on our decision packages, there are 46 of them. In your budget document, they follow the budget message. At the end of that, there's a summary of all the decision packages. And in that summary, your negative numbers are going to be your savings to the budget, so they'll either be revenues or decreased appropriations. We also have it separated out what's a one-time impact versus an ongoing impact. And then to come to a balanced budget, we have a use of the CalPERS Reserve Fund. The revenues, a number of those are from new or increased fees. So those city count, they are decision packages, and then we'll also have a budget hearing or a public hearing on June 19th where those fees will be discussed and voted on. So some of the decision packages that we've picked out to put on this slide kind of reflect the recommendations that you as a commission made in your letter to the city council in regarding the budget process. The first item is a fire pumper apparatus that has been looked at and come to the conclusion it doesn't need to be replaced. Funding had been put aside for its replacement, but now that not being needed returns to the fund where the allocation was made.
So is that being returned to the ISF fund,
From the
vehicle
IS
equipment fund, not the general fund?
From the ISF fund, where it has been held, waiting for enough funding to replace the vehicle. Now that it's not going to be replaced from that internal service fund, it's being returned to the general fund, which is the fund that was putting into.
And that's why you credit it to the general fund?
Yes.
Exactly.
Okay.
If it had been a fire boat, as an example, it would have been credited to the Tidelands Fund, as an example.
Okay, thank you.
And the other thing I would add, this is not a frontline fire engine. This is the equivalent of budgeting for the replacement of a reserve engine. So when we talk in terms of level of service to the community, this is not taking out a fire engine that's a frontline fire service to the community. This is something that we've had extensive discussions with the fire chief. The general fund had put money into the vehicle replacement fund. There is not a need to purchase that vehicle. That money gets returned to the general fund and is available for other one-time expenditures. So that's what you'll see on Roman numeral page 21 in the budget message. That's basically creates one-time savings and allows us to pay down some of our one-time expenditures.
And in addition to that, the annual depreciation schedule, which I believe was approximately $70,000 a year from the general fund, or 60 and change, to eventually replace that vehicle now will cease when we make adjustments as part of mid-year next year. So ultimately, it's an ongoing savings of 60+ thousand a year, and it frees up money for uses now.
And then the remaining decision packages listed up here. All those are vacant positions at the current time, and they are either being deauthorized, as in, until a decision down the line is made to put it back in the budget, which probably will, historically hasn't happened. But some of them are just keeping the position vacant for the fiscal year, but there's a combination of those.
So Marnie, a number of these deauthorizations and vacant positions, what has typically been the length that they've been vacant? 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, mix?
These are all 3 to 4 years for the ones that we're deauthorizing. The ones that we're holding vacant are a shorter term, 1 to 2 years that they've been vacant.
How did you come to decide on these staff positions? Was there an evaluation of the entire departments to determine which vacant positions were not providing a level of service? Was that the standard? Was it that they had remained vacant for 3 or 4 years? What general thumbnail rule did you use to come up with those positions?
Well, it was basically through discussions with the departments, what vacancies do you have? How long have they been vacant? It wasn't decided at the beginning. It was kind of what wound up happening is when a position's been not filled for 3 or 4 years, you've lived without it for a few years, it looks like you really don't need it. And didn't just cut it, but, entered into a discussion with the departments. And in the end, each of the departments that we discussed this with, basically offered this up as a reduction. So take, for example, the Recreation and Youth Services Manager. That was a position that for many years was funded and filled. But with the appointment of John LaRock, about 3+ years ago, he opted not to fill that position and opted to assigned the duties. Some he took on his own himself, some he gave to other individuals. Some portion of the work had previously been charged to CDBG, and part of that was outsourced. So that was a position, for example, that's the most valuable one up there, $152,000. Basically, there's no impact on service to the community. There's no impact on service in the organization. It's basically a savings that we can count not just this year, but into the future. So, and just to clarify, where it says deauthorization, they are taken off the books permanently. Where it's referenced as a vacancy, we've only counted the savings for 1 year. That's one where we will reevaluate after a year. We may be filling those positions. They may be deauthorized, just kind of depending on what the impact is, both in terms of services as well as to the organization.
Were there other positions that department leaders identified that didn't make the list? So did you take all of their suggestions or only some of them?
Well, they weren't too thrilled to offer up positions.
I would
to
imagine
delete.
not.
It was essentially through our budget discussions what we identified. There are other vacancies in the organization. We are constantly recruiting and hiring for vacant police and fire positions. So we only touched one of those in terms of a police position that we anticipate will be vacant anyway throughout the coming fiscal year. So we're counting that savings now. I believe that was kind of one of your commission's recommendations, that you kind of budget tighter and create a kind of a vacancy factor in terms of creating some savings to make sure that money doesn't get spent on something else. So what this will do effectively is it tightens the budget. There will be less money available at year end. A year and a half from now, whenever we close the books for the new fiscal year that's about to start. And so, one of the things that we'll evaluate as we do the year end for this coming fiscal year, which happens around December, is we will see what kind of savings that we have in terms of positions not being filled, revenues coming in compared to budget. Typically, we have an excess. I mean, you saw that at mid-year where there were allocations made by council towards projects primarily, or to put more money into the PERS reserve. So, after the budget's adopted, that's sort of the next major budget review that happens, which is at year end.
So we really appreciate the hard work on you and your staff, Mike and Marnie, and taking our recommendations earlier, the last 12 months or so. And I know those are not easy discussions, and we really appreciate the input from us and in terms of tightening the budget, and so that we can be number one in terms of the that review, right?
Second that. Thank you.
The other thing, too, is with respect to the positions, is that the total number of all vacant and deauthorized positions total, or are there more than that?
A few more on the list.
There's other vacant positions in the organization, but these are the only ones that we're purposefully holding open in order to create savings or deauthorizing.
And the police officer, number
Yeah, we're
36.
We're
Number
missing,
36, police officer is 178,000.
which is a Tidelands savings, which
Oh, yeah.
these are,
it's not
I think
up
these
there.
affect the general fund, the Tidelands position.
That looks really good. Appreciate it.
Sure.
Budget response reports are coming. You have a list in your packet of those that are. There are 36 of them. A few of them are the CalPERS rate increases that we already talked about that will be coming, and give a look out into the future on where those will be, where the CalPERS reserve fund balance will be. Some others are the Street Landscaping and Lighting District General Fund subsidy. As you look at summaries, that's the transfer out from the general fund. So that's at about $1 million most every year. So it's a significant hit to the general fund. Your input, typically it's done as the minutes from this meeting will be included with a budget response report. I'm sure that one won't be June 5th because of the timing, but it will come during the budget process, so they'll be able to see that. And then we have some others that have been identified by council that they'd like to see.
Okay, I think this might be my slide. We gave a more extensive presentation last month to the Public Works Commission, and in general, it's a fairly healthy year for the CIP. I'm not so sure I'd be as optimistic about next year's level of funding as the city manager mentioned. We don't expect to have quite as much in the form of savings at year end that would normally be deployed in the future CIP. But this year we're still pretty healthy given the council's actions at prior year end and some of the more recent transportation sources that have come online at the state and regional level. In general, the proposed 18-19 CIP includes 84 total projects, and as Joe mentioned, almost $56 million in total funding. In terms of specific appropriations this year, an additional $13 million is recommended, and that's for a combination of projects that have been in the plan for some time, as well as 12 new projects to the plan. From a highlight perspective, I won't go through all of them in great detail, but you can see our biggest chunk of money is in the form of street improvements. This has been a major priority for the council. At year end, they set aside a significant chunk of money for traffic calming and some additional residential resurfacing. As I mentioned, we've seen new Measure M, SB1 funds, some additional gas tax monies come our way to allow for additional street efforts. We've been very successful in pursuing Regional Measure R funds on a competitive level. Big credit to Ted and his company and crew for being successful in accruing those funds. And really, for us, that's been our focus for some time. Streets and core infrastructure really a priority for this community, for the prior city councils as well as the one that we've had here in the last couple of years. Drainage project, that's unfortunately you'll see later in the slide, that's the biggest chunk of money out of our general discretionary funds this year, $850,000. That's part of a two-payment program to contribute towards a regional project that's being constructed in Hermosa Beach near the Greenbelt. It has to do with infiltrating and diverting stormwater runoff through the Gerondo Street storm drain, which has been problematic over the years from a water quality standpoint. It's a conglomerate effort, LA County, City of Hermosa Beach, City of Torrance, as well as the City of Redondo Beach. Our share of that project is about $1.7 million in total construction funding. This would be the first of two payments. Why I mention it as a challenge is we don't have a dedicated source of revenue for what we call our Enhanced Watershed Management Program projects, or our municipal stormwater permit requirements. And that is unfortunately going to drain or utilize most of our discretionary funds for the foreseeable future until we can identify an external source of funds. We are aware of that the county is pursuing a stormwater fee that would ultimately be a partial assessment that might help contribute dedicated funds for these efforts into the future. But until any type of funding comes along, we're going to be struggling to meet what is estimated to be about a $20 million obligation over the next 10 years for our MS4 requirements. So keep that in the back of your mind. Again, highlights on the street surfacing side. We've got new funds for Beryl Street improvements between Flagler and Prospect, much needed. We've got funding for Englewood Avenue resurfacing. We have about $2.7 million for a combination of residential roadway resurfacing as well as reslurring, and we have a variety of other smaller sort of commercial improvements in addition to our carryover funds for significant projects that we've mentioned in the past: Prospect Avenue, Flagler, Manhattan Beach Boulevard, the commercial streets up in North Redondo, Space Parkway, Redondo Avenue, et cetera. So very, very healthy road effort here over the next couple of years, something I think we can all be very proud of. Question?
Mike, is there an interface for the Kingsdale widening with the transit center?
There's additional funding through Regional Measure R. We were able to grab this year about $1 million for some of those efforts. There's already prior appropriations to cover that effort. So in total, that new transit center project, which the council approved plans and specifications for last week or a couple weeks ago now, that's in total, after all 3 phases are complete, the Kingsdale realignment, addition of the turn lane, and then full resurfacing of the area, beautification of the right-of-way, as well as the new transit center. We're talking about $10 million of external funds really enhancing that area. It's going to be a great project.
About 10% of that with the Kingsdale.
10% of that is the Kingsdale, just the resurfacing component, and then the widening itself is another chunk as well. So it's a nice effort up there. It's going to be a really major impact from a beautification standpoint. On the waterfront side, big chunk of this money is really the next phase of parking structure repair. We've had some good success with that this fiscal year. We'll need to fund and then plan for next phase of plans and specifications. Park projects, probably the largest chunk of that money is for Dominguez Park, which is, as many of you know, due for a significant rehabilitation. We already have funding in the CIP for Veterans Park, which is another big project that's long overdue. So those two will be happening in the upcoming months. Dominguez will take some time to design and then build, but Veterans should be constructed here in the next few months, which will be nice, or at least shovels in the ground. And then on the public facility side, a couple of different projects there. We have been stockpiling PEG fees, which are restricted to sort of council chamber video broadcasting, sort of chamber improvements. So this place is going to get a facelift in the next year. So a good portion of those PEG funds, which can't be used on anything else, unfortunately, but will be nice to help us enhance this facility, both from an audiovisual standpoint as well as a technical standpoint. Our IT in here is pretty tired and use a refresh.
Can I ask a quick question? What is the PEG fees? What is that?
It's basically a public access fee that is paid for by different cable operators. So under state charter, they have to set aside fees that go to municipal governments. We accrue those funds. We have very limited ability to use them. It's always a source of frustration, but we now do have a project coming online that can tap that pot. So we're excited about that.
So in case you're wondering, PEG stands for Public Access, Education, and Government Programming. So it's used PEG for short. So an eligible use of those funds to do upgrades to this facility, including the audio video, is because it's government video production, you know, that passes the test in terms of the use for those funds. That's what a lot of cities do with those funds.
$8 a month on my bill.
Right. It's about all we can do with them. And then there's also an effort, we've got some set-aside money, and then we're pursuing a grant to install some electric vehicle charging stations in different areas in the community. I think we have 5 planned sites up and down the city, both South and North Redondo, that makes up another portion of that. And then we also have recommended $350,000 appropriation out of our major facilities repair fund for a significant repair to the library elevator. I'm sure you've all ridden the elevator. It's probably the slowest elevator west of the Mississippi, and unfortunately it breaks down too frequently. So we need to spend some money it's safe, it's just very slow. But we need to spend some money to significantly rehabilitate that structure. So that's another big chunk of the public facilities monies. Next slide, please. This, as I mentioned, it's a combination of new funding as well as carryover money. This is money that's been previously appropriated that is in some form of design or planned construction. We're fortunate to have the money we have, and I mentioned some of the key projects. Again, you can see the focus on street improvements. The big chunk of money for public facilities has to do with the transit center project. Next slide, please. And this really breaks down how our discretionary funds are being used. So most of projects are funded through an external or restricted source, whether it be transit or we just mentioned PEG. Really limited choices as to what you can do with it. When it comes to the money that's discretionary, that's come from savings in the general fund at prior year end that we set aside for next year appropriation, this is the pot of money that we can really spend on just about anything. The council has already earmarked a few of these items items for the CIP this year. The skate park pre-design work is an example of that. Traffic calming efforts I mentioned earlier, that was a big focus and priority for the city council, residential street resurfacing. And then, as has been discussed here, there was a set aside for Wilderness Park improvements as well. So those have really been spoken for. The biggest, the remaining source of funds, unfortunately, all has to go to our contract obligations with our partner cities in the EWIMP, which again is the Enhanced Watershed Management Program, which is the document and the planned project list of projects that our region must execute to meet our municipal stormwater permit requirements that the State Water Board through the Los Angeles region impart on all cities. So again, just in a sense, an unfunded mandate that we have to use a big chunk of our discretionary funds for.
The 850?
That's the 850. And as I said, that's one of two payments. So next year we'll have to spend that much again, sadly. Budget calendar.
And here's where we are in the budget process. We're tonight about halfway down. The budget has been released. City Council saw it on May 15th. They set the public hearing for June 5th. This is your first review, so that's new this year, that there'll be a second review by you as the commission on June 14th. That's kind of in the middle of City Council's public hearings. They'll start those public hearings on June 5th, continue it to June 12th with a focus on CIPs. And then the plan is for the budget to be adopted on June 19th. And our recommendation for you tonight is just to receive and file the budget and the 5-year CIP. And we're here to answer any questions you might have.
Yeah, I actually had time to review it this year, so I have a laundry list of questions and comments. Do you guys want me to just proceed?
Go for it.
Okay, all right. Just a question on the just on the revenues comparison. I was just wondering what that big increase in the intergovernment grants were for that mid-year 17-18. It was like a huge. It's just under the revenue.
Right. The Intergovernmental Grants Fund is just as its name says. It is grant funding. So much of our grant funding is for capital projects, like Mike mentioned. The transit center is grant funded. So those are mostly carried over. For example, again, the transit center, we've known about that grant funding for some time, so it's carried over into subsequent years. So it'll show up in the mid-year budget. It won't show up in this proposed budget, but then when we do carryovers come November, when we know completely how fiscal year 17 and 18 ended up, will carry over what hasn't been spent again.
And those sources are cyclical. So as an example, last year, major projects came online. We had 5 different regional Measure R projects have funding come available. We also had the major transit center project receive appropriation. So when we request money from LA County, as an example, or other state agencies, we're looking at projects that might have a couple $100,000 in one year, and then 3 years later, we might have a plan for a significant public facility that might have multiple millions of dollars in it. So it's not uncommon for us to see swings in this category, depending on different grant years.
Okay. And then just on the top level, under the expenditures tab, as you guys already outlined, and it's in the detail that you can't really compare from the mid-year because it's got that skew in there for the maintenance and operations for the carryovers, and you already put in the detail. It was about $2.5 million for carryovers. Okay, so so basically, if you look at the adopted budget for last year versus the proposal, we're looking at the total expenses actually are going up 2.2 million, and, from the adopted last year's budget. Just wanted to make that, a note on that. And also that, a question, if you look at the decrease for the maintenance and operations, it's like 3.1 million. You take the 2.5 million out because of the carryovers. Is there real reductions going on in this maintenance and operation expense? Because there's there's like 600K then of a reduction. And if there is, what is actually of that maintenance and expense? What expenses are going down?
Yeah, I think what you might want to look at would be from a more structural change standpoint, because as you mentioned, with carryovers, it's difficult to track exactly what the core charges are doing. But it would be in the areas of, in the various decision package where you might have a change for consulting services, or we've made reductions this year in the Tidelands for transient vessel mooring maintenance. I think we have perhaps an elimination of funds that were in our city manager's office budget for obligations under the Chamber of Service, Chamber contract that we had in previous years. So those are changes to kind of the M&O category that would be structural in nature. They wouldn't be a one-time change, but they would be an actual ongoing reduction to the budget. That would just be an example of a few of them. There I think, might be a few others.
Okay.
And then in addition to carryover appropriations, you also have one-time appropriations. For example, the decision packages for 18-19 that you can see the summary listing of show those one-time appropriations. Well, 17-18 had those as well. So they are taken out of the core budget. They were one-time 17-18.
Okay. But none of these, I want to understand that none of these figures have the decision package numbers in there.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So
They're all
we're,
pre-decision packages.
Yeah, they're pre-decision package. So, again, if we just take out this mid-year, we compare 17-18 adopted, we're looking at our expenses are going up 2.2 million from that. And so also, okay, so my next question is, I was wondering about the, I pulled up some detail on, from the transparency website on the maintenance and operations expense. Like, I wanted to understand what those kind of expenses are, and you can actually get it off your, that transparency. And it's the summary. Let me see. The summary has. I guess we're okay with that one. That one's all right. Okay. I was looking at the ISF allocation. I had a question about the detail on ISF allocation line item. I'm trying to understand if all these line items, like personnel obviously is staff expenses. And if you pull out the maintenance and operations and you get some kind of the detail on it, it looks like there's a few line items that are labor related. So I guess what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get the total percentage of labor-related expenses to the total budget, okay? Because you guys have here that, personnel is 65%. But in effect, there is, some expenses within these other line items that are labor-related. Like in maintenance and operations, we've got the contracts and professional services, and we've got attorney fees. So they're the outsourced, labor
Right.
items and things like that. So if I looked at that, that was adding another 3 million, so like about 3 million out of the maintenance and operations is line item is labor related. And then I was looking at detail on the ISF fund, and that one looked like there was, where was I pulling that from? There was a personnel expense item, oh, here it is. Personnel services, this is just based on the CAFR. I'm assuming it was from one of the budget response items from mid-year where you guys gave us detail on what is in the revenue and expense line items for ISF. And it looks like there is also a personnel services, so of about 4.7 million. So I guess what I'm trying to say is if you add up that personnel line item, you add like about 3 million out of the maintenance and operations, you add like another 4.7 million out of the ISF, you're looking at a total labor out of the budget of about 67 million, which is really about 74% of the budget. So I'm just trying to, make a comment that really this budget is primarily all labor.
It's for a service
really.
organization.
Yeah, no, and we know that, and I'm just making, so if we really want to look at, okay, where do we, obviously, so if we're looking at cutting costs and things, we have to target, that's where we target that. Okay, so that was
Just one thing to add to that analysis, and I think you're right on the money. The only thing to make sure you remember is that when you add ISF to that equation,
Yeah.
the number grows. It's the baseline is no longer 90 million. It's actually something much larger than that. So the ISF takes that up a little bit higher.
Okay, because you're saying, because there is some that's not in the general.
Right, and there's a lot
Understand.
of equipment and other things in there that aren't reflected in that $90 million.
Well,
So-
I mean, are you saying, well, what I'm saying is like maybe the 4.7 million, what you're saying is that's not all personnel services within the general fund.
Right.
They're in like with the other funds.
And your total appropriations are going to go up to something like almost 125 million as your denominator then, when you're trying to calculate percentage. That's all I'm saying but you're absolutely right. We are a personnel, and we're a service organization, and most of what we do is people related.
Okay.
Whether it's, contract professionals or our own staff.
Okay, all right, and then, so, let's see. On questions I had with, and I'm going to move on to the budget decision packages, some questions I had there. On item number 11, can you just outline examples of what these community development department fees that are being increased, what are some examples of what are those fees?
If you come in for plan check services, you come in to pull a permit for encroachment review, these fees are meant to be cost recovery for our organization, so we're not subsidizing that activity. If a developer's here to have us analyze a 2-unit project or a 15-unit project, we are collecting fees that are commensurate with our charges, and we periodically increase these to make sure we fully recover our costs.
Like permit fees?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah,
all right.
permit and inspection.
Permit and what?
Inspection, like building inspection.
Okay, all right, thank you. I just wanted to clarify that.
Commissioner Esser, if you don't mind, if we could just have Commissioner Solomon. We'll get back, I know you have a lot of questions.
Sure.
Commissioner Solomon.
Oh, I have a lot of questions. Thank you. So I want
Okay,
to,
well, can I just finish up on my decision?
go ahead.
Oh, sure.
Packaging
sure.
questions, and then I'll relate to him,
Sure.
and then if and then I also have some questions about the department-specific budgets as well.
Sure,
Okay.
please continue.
Okay, sorry, okay. All right, so just looking at the decision packages number 24, 27, and 38, you're looking at those are the, just to summarize real quick, those are the uniforms for the fire department, the emergency communication equipment replacement, and the IT equipment replacement. And have those expenses, I know that one of the budget response questions from the council is about the necessity of all the fees under 27 of the increased costs. I guess my question is, these are large numbers. Is there any room there for, reductions in these costs, or?
We have reserved for these expenses for some time, anticipating them, and worked on a regional basis to try to identify the most cost-effective way to replace this equipment. And in some cases, we're shifting to new networking, new shared networking. But this has been well vetted, and I think we've tested it in the marketplace from a costing perspective. And unfortunately, I think the answer is no. This is the cost of us replacing this equipment.
So in the interest of being effective, I had the same question on those, and maybe a related question. I would add in number 39. And so
Yeah, I was getting to that one.
my question's the same, but it's my understanding that a decision package is something that we need to adjust mid-year. But I look at these, and these are, in some cases, half of the annual budget for vehicle replacement or something like that. And for 39, we apparently need 20 vehicles, or we need $700,000 of radio equipment. How did these pop up suddenly, so to speak?
The answer is actually they don't pop up suddenly at all. There's a long-term amortization schedule for every vehicle in our fleet. We have over 200 units. This represents about 10% of our fleet. Some vehicles have a 5-year life cycle. Some have a 20-year life cycle. Our large equipment, dump trucks, et cetera, much longer life cycles. Our fire truck, our ladder truck is an example, longer life cycle. But every year, kind of like the discussion about the intergovernmental grants, a year may have a couple of really big pieces of equipment come due for replacement that have been accruing for a number of years. And in some years, it's just the standard fare. We might be replacing a bunch of police sedans or other smaller units. So every year, it could be, it's usually a fairly big number because we have a big fleet, but it ebbs and flows with the timing of replacement, which is amortized schedule. This is very planned.
And I think that's my question, and maybe it's more a question of process that I don't understand. It is planned, and it's something that's foreseeable. Why is it not in the budget at the beginning of the year? Why is it a mid-year add?
This isn't a mid-year act. This is the beginning of the year act.
This is a decision, change for next year.
Yeah.
Changed July 1st.
Yeah.
right?
Thank you.
And is there detail on all those vehicle I mean, I don't know, I did go through the budget, but I don't know.
There's a budget response report that details it every year.
There'll be one coming.
Oh, there will be
You'll
one
have one
coming.
at your next meeting.
Yeah.
Okay, so that'll be in the works. Okay, okay, and then on number 28, it's, the police department reorganization. You're getting rid of 2 positions, replacing it with 2 different. In this reorg, is there any way that we can identify more reductions for like staff administration or something in this kind of reorg?
We tried very hard with this reorganization to start with cost neutrality and then do what we could to actually try to save the general fund some money. This could have very easily been a cost increase, candidly, due to state mandates associated with how we have to manage folks that are currently being held in our jail. Has to do with male and female requirements, supervisory requirements, safety requirements. You can't have an individual attend folks that are being held. You have to have at least one other member there available to support. So this, candidly, could have easily been a couple $100,000 increase to the budget, but we worked very close with the chief to try to figure out a cost neutral, and we were able to come away with some savings way to meet these new unfunded mandates.
Okay.
And we also, that's one of the budget response reports, we go into some detail about what specifically is recommended and why. So that's another detailed report that you'll get at your next meeting.
Okay. Okay, and then on number 32, I was wondering if any of this cost can be, I'm assuming it can't because you're putting it in there, but any of the monies seized, you said that usually we fund this from monies, from drug monies seized and things, so, but we still need 190 to fund this vehicle identification
Well,
item.
it's coming from that seized money. The 190,000 is coming from our asset forfeiture account.
Okay,
So it's not a general fund expense.
okay. Okay, and then, just looking at all the, if you add up, you know, all the ups and the downs from the decision packages, you're looking at, you know, total expenses. I mean, I know this is it's not just general fund, it's overall, but we're just looking at overall expenses here. All these decision packages are going to increase expenses by like $2,572,000. Revenues are going to go up 17,000. So we've got, you know, obviously a big deficit of these, with these, I mean, and I'm talking real costs, because I know that all the positions that we're talking about, of taking them out of the budget, there's 6 positions, they add up to about 691,000, but to me, I'm looking at, they're not real costs, like real cost savings, because they're not costs that we're incurring right now. So what I'm saying is, you know, obviously if we do all these decision packages and we approve them all, we're looking at, you know, adding to our deficit of like, of 1.8 million in additional costs. And then, like we said before, the summary, we're increasing costs 2.2 million, and our revenues are only going up 1.9 million. So we've already got a deficit of about, you know, 300,000 there from the overall, and now we're adding all these items in there. So now we're upping the deficit another 1.9 million, or
Well,
1.8 million.
I'd hesitate to go that far. I think that the distinction here is there are ongoing revenues and expenses, right? You have to look at that category. So if you flip
Right.
to your back page there, and you see, we actually put these into different columns to kind of help at the end of the budget message.
Right.
That would pertain to our structural budget, right? And to your point, yeah, there is about a $300,000 structural shortfall between ongoing revenues and dedicated expenses. That's true. The other expenses, though, they're not I wouldn't call them an increased expense. They're an expense in this upcoming year, coming from one-time items from previously funded budgets. So when you're talking about the 1.3 million in vehicles, that's coming from a fund that's created and dedicated specifically for that expense. So
Right.
it's a pre-funded expense. We're now actually getting to the point where we need to buy that equipment. So
Right.
I think your point about managing and looking to that structural issue is a big one, and something that we follow very closely to. And I think I made this comment before the commission. Last year was the first year we were actually, from an ongoing revenue to ongoing expenditure standpoint, structurally balanced for about the last decade. You know, and to Joe's point earlier, this is the year we're using the least amount of PERS reserve funding to help us bridge what is about a $350,000 gap. So we slipped a little bit on an ongoing basis, but we feel it's marginal enough that we can manage it going forward. So we were concerned that it could be even a bigger issue this year. And while, yes, you're right that the position reductions this year, the 3 cuts and then the 3 positions being held vacant, we didn't have those expenses last year, but they were booked expenses in the budget, as we've talked about. And that's us, to Joe's point, tightening that up to be a little bit more specific. And those positions will be lost to service for years to come. So, and that's helping us, of course, achieve, near structural balance. So,
Well, yeah, I mean, and to your point, like, I just looked down on a historical basis, and if you look at, the increase in revenues versus the increase in expenses over the last 5 years, this is just general fund, the revenues have increased 12.8% over the last 5 years, and expenses have gone up 22.5%. So, obviously, we can't just keep doing this, and we've got to, start, we can't keep taking from reserves, from our CalPERS reserves to fund the deficit. We can't keep doing that, into the future. So we do have to be more proactive in getting, and looking and identifying the cost cuts. And as I said, it's primarily labor with the general fund. So let's see if I had any other questions. So we could look at these three positions that you're saying, you know, okay, we'll keep them vacant for this year. What has to happen in your perspective for those to be turned to a decommission?
A full deauthorization?
Yes.
You know, what we would do is basically reflect on the experience of the next year. I mean, one of those is a payroll technician. We also, at the same time, you'll notice one of the budget decision packages is some outsourcing, some assistance from an outside firm to help with payroll.
Right.
So, you know, we're going to look at that experience. We're going to look at the accuracy of payroll. We're going to look at the workload, what's going to be the impact on our overtime budget. We've got a human resources position along the same lines. So, I mean, that was essentially, you know, we are just counting the savings for 1 year. There is a good chance that those positions would be deauthorized. I mean, part of this is also going to be dependent on the resources that we have. If the money isn't there, that's the first place we're going to look. We would rather eliminate an unfilled position rather than take joy in eliminating
Right.
someone's job and having layoffs. We really try to avoid layoffs. This is not something that we're actively looking to lay people off. We've had that situation before, and we have had layoffs. I mean, if it comes to that, it comes to that, but we're fortunate that we're not recommending that this year. At least from my standpoint, that's a good thing.
Okay, and those three are the ones that you said have been basically unfilled for like 1 to 2 years?
The ones that we're holding open for a year, it's
Yeah.
1 to 2 years. The ones that we're deauthorizing, 3 to 4 years.
Okay,
So in the same light of being on the same topic, in the total citywide org chart, how many unfilled positions still remain?
You have another approximately 8 in the fire department that are actively being recruited for and filled now. We are close to full complement in the police department, but I'd say because of the revolving nature of retirements and bringing people on, there's probably another 3 to 4 that are being actively recruited there. We have a couple of positions in the public works department, one payroll manager position that we're actively recruiting for. So we've got, you know, another 15 or so in the organization, maybe 20, that are in some form of recruitment.
Out of 442, it's pretty.
It's a pretty small
pretty
number.
close. I
Yeah,
mean,
we're
that's-
getting pretty tight.
Probably most companies aren't that close, so that's pretty much full.
And to the city manager's point, you know, these 3, so, you know, 3 are coming off the books permanently, 3 are now being held vacant. As Joe said, those are the first, if we need that structural savings on an ongoing basis rather than one time, those are the first 3 that likely get looked at next fiscal year. You know, we can hope for maybe some additional revenue to maybe offset it, but I think as we've all said up here, you know, with PERS obligations in the future, it's gonna be a belt-tightening few years, to say the least.
Not to throw a giant question in the middle of all this, but with the Galleria restructuring, do we see any substantial increase in revenues? I mean, that's going to be a construction project, it's going to be a long-term project. When are we going to start seeing that to increase?
Well, if the project that's currently proposed were to be approved, fully entitled, and constructed, it has the potential to provide us somewhere between $1.5 million and $2 million of tax increment. Will it? That remains to be seen.
Thank you.
And what's the expected impact while it's under construction?
Well, given the way that they've planned to phase their installation and given the fact that they are nowhere near prior peak levels, given the general state of affairs out there, not that significant. They plan to build, if you look at their program, and again, this is still, who knows, but they plan to build on the east side first and leave the mall as operable as possible through the course of that first phase of construction, and then they would do renovations to the interior of the mall as a secondary phase. So I think it would be quite some time before we'd see full tax increment, but I think they'd probably hold the line fairly closely over the course of construction.
okay. you just touched on that, you know, that we're increasing, or we're asking for an increase of 55,000 for outsourcing on payroll services. Shouldn't there be a corresponding, like, reduction in staff and, like, you know, since we are outsourcing those services? And again, another reason as to looking at decommissioning number 34, the financial services payroll tech position.
Yeah, so this is what we're doing on a one-year basis. So this is kind of on a trial basis. We're holding a position open, we're doing some outsourcing. You know, that's basically what we're gonna look at over the course of the next several months. And we may be back and making this a permanent adjustment to the budget.
Okay. So other than this unfilled position, though, is there any overtime, any other expenses that we could, you know, or there's some kind of reduction that can happen with outsourcing of this, for this, of the payroll?
That
You know-
vacant number is a fully loaded
Yeah.
cost.
No.
It includes the salary and the benefits and
No, I
all
understand,
that
but-
that's being, you know, not used this year in the general fund expenses.
Right.
And instead, this contract amount.
Most of our finance department that works on payroll, with the exception of the one technician that remains versus the one that's being held, so we had two technicians, those positions are management positions, they're not paid overtime.
Okay. All right. So what you're basically saying is whoever's doing the work now that's going to be outsourced is not getting paid for it
Right.
because
It's
they
being
don't get
absorbed,
overtime.
yes.
Okay. All right. Okay. All right. And then, okay, so that's what I have for decision. So if somebody else wants to start asking their questions and then.
Commissioner Solomon?
I'll just chime in that if Marnie's getting the payroll done with one person, I will applaud her for that, outsourced or not.
Something. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, staff, for the presentation. To amplify what I mentioned a little bit earlier, so you had Manhattan Beach save themselves $700,000 by implementing an automated system for some of their plan checks. You've got plenty of resources out there, small government, big problems, to be able to improve your efficiencies, which will have the ripple effect of thereby reducing potentially your workers' compensation costs, reducing your CalPERS exposures in an ongoing basis. You said you don't want to lay people off, but as those positions become vacant with automation, you can fill those holes without a reduction in a level of service for residents. In fact, it might improve a level of service for residents by allowing them to off-site access those services, which I don't know if we really fully implement right now.
We're on the path to implementation, online permitting and the like, and that very well may lead to what you're describing.
Okay, that sounds great. So a few questions that I have. I'm going to start off with a question here in the decision packets where we, on item 16 with the elimination of the, and 15, the elimination of the chamber contractual services and the elimination of the chamber directory, I would expect that there would also be a commensurate credit there for the TOT that we're retaining.
That's already in the budget.
Okay, so that's a part of the other.
Yeah, we absorbed that last fiscal year through the adjustments that were
So
made.
that's how you allocated it,
Yeah.
was just leaving it in the general fund?
Well,
Was it
just-
being paid out of the general fund?
It was, yes.
Right. Okay. With item number 44 for the Artesia Boulevard Corridor Storefront Improvement Program, the $50,000, is this a fresh $50,000 in addition to what we had funded before?
Yes.
Was the full rack of the previous allocation spent?
We're in the final stages of that, but yes, we did wind up allocating. We had businesses come forward. It was a shared program for storefront improvements, and we had 2 or 3 cycles come forward with funding. So yeah, we will spend all that. That was $100,000.
That was
So-
100.
So this would be an additional $50,000 on top of that.
How are we monitoring our return on that investment?
It's still new. I mean, we just approved the first round of applications about a month and a half ago. They're under construction. The second round was approved at the last city council, full city council meeting a couple of weeks ago. From a monitoring ROI, we're going to need to see those storefronts implemented and then see how they perform. I will say, and I don't have the numbers exact off the top of my head, but I believe the private contribution, in addition to the match, most businesses ultimately decided to invest much more. And I think the bottom line tally was something closer to a 2-to-1 than it was a 1-to-1 match. So that at least is a metric. But yes, on the long term, until we see sales tax receipts and we see vitalization of Artesia, it's hard to know.
Well, we're putting a lot of money into Artesia. There's going to be the money for the bike path up there and some of the
Correct.
other improvements. I'm just thinking on a really tight budget where you've got $50,000 that to re-rack $50,000 into a program that hasn't proven itself out might be a place where you would want to wait for a year.
It's a fair question.
Rather than just re-racking it without any proof of concept.
Yeah,
So speaking of Artesia, is there any hope for the Albertson site?
There is. From what I understand, CVS is still making their way through with plans and updates. Exactly when, it's hard to say. My understanding for the delay is that CVS is opening or remodeling stores all over the place, and for some reason, they just have been slow to get here and get going.
Yeah, I mean, I really would hate to see that deteriorate any further. You know, it's
Yep.
an eyesore to have that vacant that long.
Yep.
On a couple of the departments, when we were talking about increases within departments, I was surprised and learned something new every day that the city attorney and I discovered, even though it wasn't listed here in the packet, the city clerk are guaranteed salary increases each year by the municipal code. So other than the city attorney and the city clerk, are there any other elected officials or employees that automatically get a raise based on the municipal code?
No, the council's schedule for their little bit of salary, if you will, it's not, I think it's $960 a month or whatever it is, that is also set by resolution under the guidance of the municipal code. This commission actually has a role in that 4-year analysis that occurs for each of those positions as we get near the upcoming election.
Wouldn't we have to modify the municipal code to alter the increase?
The municipal code sets a process by which the council approves the schedule by resolution, I believe.
But it's not tied into a cost of living adjustment.
I shouldn't say that, no.
There's a fixed number there.
It is a fixed number. I shouldn't say that it's by resolution. I believe there is a process for ordinance update based on the schedule. There's a review by the commission, there's consideration by the council, and then the council sets via ordinance update the new salary for the upcoming 4-year term.
So for those of you playing at home, that's the municipal code section 2.3.902. So these are increases that are every year. Is there a cap on it?
It's up to the council. They set it at the time. So we'll go through this exercise here, well, aside from the existing election question, but if we were normal course of action, 2019 upcoming election this fall, actually late this summer, you would receive a review and consideration and make recommendations to council as it relates to the next 4-year pay.
I think it's odd that the 2 elected officials are guaranteed salary raises per the municipal code, but not the other city employees like yourselves have to wait it out. But
one thing that whenever there are increases to the executive employees or other employee groups, those are negotiated, those are budgeted for. Those increases do not automatically apply to those 2 elected officials. So
according to the municipal code, they do.
Just the benefits.
just the benefits.
Just the
So if
benefits,
there's
not
a
salary.
So think about it this way. There had been prior increases to other appointed officials, department heads, management professional, supervisory employees that were negotiated, that were approved by the council, that were part of multi-year pay plans. during that same time period, there were not the equivalent salary increases to those two elected positions. And so basically what happens is, on a 4-year basis, those salaries are looked at. There's a public process that goes through this commission, it goes to council, and there's a schedule that winds up getting adopted for the next 4 years.
About every 4 years. Okay,
Yeah.
that was one of my questions too. Thank you.
Not like they've gotten increases along with everyone else and they're getting this.
Yeah, well, I mean, it sticks out because there's about 482 cities in the state of California. Not all of them are charter cities, and 12 of them have an elected city attorney. The rest of them are employees, as an example. I don't know how many city clerks there are. So speaking of the city attorney's department, when we talk about, and I'll have to dig into it a little bit further here, when the city attorney goes out and retains outside counsel, is there a budget by which they are capped and then they come back for a reappropriation, say we're working on X, Y, and Z in closed session and we need another appropriation for outside counsel?
It depends. There's 3 general pots that are appropriate at the start of every fiscal year. There's a pot for sort of general proactive municipal work. There's a pot through our internal service fund that has to do with workers' compensation, liability, litigation, et cetera. And then there's a pot for general litigation matters under the internal service fund. Those pots are drawn down on, and sometimes at mid-year we have to make adjustments to those pots in order to pay for expenses. As you know, the last couple of years have been pretty hot from a litigation standpoint, so we've had to make some adjustments to the ISF figure there to cover those expenses. So yeah, the budget is set at the beginning of the year, it's evaluated at mid-year and adjusted through our ISF process, and it's an evolving process.
So that ends up being an ISF charge to maintenance and operations for the city
Professional
attorney's
contracts,
department?
yep.
Professional contracts.
Yeah.
Because we had 9 employees in the city attorney's office, and now we have 11, a couple of years ago, and now we have 11. Obviously, our litigation has kind of exploded in the last few years, and so there's a lot of outside counsel that we're retaining.
Yeah, it's about 500, and if you look over the average annual amount they spend on outside counsel, it's about $500,000 a year over the last 5 years.
So just, you know.
Covers a lot of activity.
If there's an audit process to see what we're doing there, you know, we have 11 staff people in a city attorney's office. We're taking on prosecutions for other cities, and yet we're spending more and more money on outside counsel.
Now, the good side about that is we are receiving reimbursement for those services, and it does become a revenue stream for the department as well when they
For the
shared-
prosecutions.
Yes, shared services for Most Beach is an example we receive. I think we just approved a contract for reimbursement where we're expecting a couple $100,000 in revenue as a result of that service.
Yeah.
It
So you have-
largely covers costs, but there is some cushion there to cover overhead and the like.
Usually, one firm would have a variety of attorneys with a variety of expertise. There'd be somebody that has an expertise in personal injury litigation, to be somebody that has an expertise in governmental resource. And then the different partners within a firm and the junior attorneys and the clerks and the paralegals and on down all have different billing rates. And I've seen it where we experience the different billing rates. But when you go out and you negotiate with outside counsel, you find a counsel, you find a firm that has a variety of these capacities, and you negotiate a rate with them, and for a significant discount, usually, because you're funneling them so much business.
And you would, if you do take a look at the contracts that our attorney's office has with outside counsel, they are actually well below market for virtually all levels of an attorney, whether it's an associate or a partner. There are a couple of exceptions, you know, very hot litigation, real specialty matters. You might see something that's near market. But if you look at the hourly rates for our contract attorneys, I'd encourage you to do that. They're actually quite good
I did.
by
A junior
comparison.
associate was getting $350 an hour.
On
one
well, that's probably the one hot issue.
Okay.
Do you know what firm you were looking at?
I do.
Yeah, I can tell you what issue that is. That's
Okay.
Look at the other ones. I'd strongly suggest you do that. That our attorney works really hard to negotiate those rates down. I think he does a pretty good job with it.
Okay, we seem to have a lot of outside counsel, and it seems like knowing a little bit about that area of the world, I would suggest that there could be one or two firms that would have all of these areas of expertise rather than 10 or 12. You always want the best, and then we might be able to utilize our resources to negotiate a little bit better rate off of that. Because then those one or two will be getting a lot more business.
Well, I'll give
from
you
us.
just a really crude example. That same firm I think you're referring to, the partner rate is even higher than the
Oh,
associate rate.
I would think it's closer to 600.
But I will tell you, it's half of what that individual collects on the open market. So to put it in some perspective, even that, which is probably our most expensive outside counsel for a very unique issue, is at about 50% of market rate.
Just looking at a series of fees or an area of our exposure that seems relatively unchecked. And it's something you can't control to a certain extent, but there are aspects of it that you can audit and monitor to another extent. Sounds like there is a lot of that
There
going
is.
on.
We work pretty hard to try to control those costs. It's the nature of litigation is a challenge, as you know.
It is. Okay, and every attorney's job is to bill as many hours as possible. We
do our best to avoid those
You sit there
billings,
and
but-
you've got your billing sheet next to you, next to the phone, and every phone call is at
Sound like
least
you've used a lot of
0.30.
attorneys.
Yeah, every letter you write is at least 1.0.
That's right. Every phone call.
Every phone call.
Yeah, absolutely.
There are guys out there billing 24 hours in an 8-hour day, and that's not unusual at all. And that's why the audit is so important.
It is.
Speaking of some of the liabilities and things that we have, with regard to our workers' compensation, our increase was $1.7 million, I think it was, if I read it correctly.
Sounds right.
So is the work comp part of our pool coverage, or is that something that we self-insure for? Or do we have another carrier for that?
Boy, you're testing my memory on this, and we can get you more specific answers if you'd like to know. I believe it's a combination. We are self-insured up to a certain level of expense, and then we kick into our pooled coverage. I believe we're at a $500,000 SIR, if I recall.
500,000
Yeah.
on the general liability.
Sounds right. And so it's as you might expect. So we manage those expenses best we can on the front side. As we've talked about here, it's three areas of the world that are, seeing massive increases in costing. It's the medical profession, it's the legal profession, and it's, unfortunately in our case, it's state mandates that allow for these guaranteed injury claims.
Yeah, I don't want to open up Pandora's box. I'm just saying the 1.7 million I was trying to boil down to, is that a premium increase? Or is it something else?
That's aggregate. That's an aggregate expense. That's actual expenses. That's insurance costs. It's a combination. That has to do with how we fund. So that fund includes resources for all of those different expenditures.
So it's in a conglomeration
Yes.
of all of those things.
Yes.
Is there somewhere in there that I can isolate that or offline to
We
find out?
could
where
probably
it's coming
get you
from
some
where?
additional detail through that ISF. I think we talked about some of that, when
Okay.
we come back
I'll
with
check
some
with
of the
you offline
detail.
about that and try and
Some of
isolate
that won't be available, just given the nature of the
I
expenses.
understand. It's
but,
it's
yeah.
either closed session or privileged info.
Yeah.
Okay. When we're talking about ISF charges, we talked about the library. And I noticed that the library's ISF charge here, that the library has a deficit of 4.6 million, and that the ISF portion of that is $2 million. And we talked about how we were going to perhaps reallocate the way that we were charging the library, for example, with the parking structure there. Is that reflected in this $2 million
No,
charge?
we have not made that change yet, but we are committed to making that change at mid-year.
So we're giving the library $40,000 to buy more resources.
We are.
But they're negative 4.6 million for the year.
Well, they're a cost operation. We don't expect the library to be a cost recovery center.
It's like a park.
Exactly.
It's a benefit.
It's a service.
It's a public service. But if we can then, going forward, try and.
We are. We're looking at
Deal
two
with
things
that.
in particular that have come through our conversations of late. One, the use of the meeting room to try to, out of fairness to the library, to be more accurate in that allocation, charge the various departments that use that meeting room on regular occasion and divert some of those expenses. Again, they don't go away. They just get absorbed by other
Allocate
operations.
them to a different department. I
Exactly.
understand.
And then another example would be the parking structure. While a good portion of that structure, of course, is for the library, it obviously serves the Civic Center campus, so we'll be distributing some of those expenses to the rest of the campus as well.
I parked on the street, so don't charge them for that.
We'll keep that in mind when we do our real detailed granular figures.
With the, so you expected a $280,000 increase in fees off of what looked like the fire inspection program. So it went from 600,000 to 900,000. That'd be 2,500 inspections at $113 an inspection. When did the program start? We started it a year ago?
Well, we approved it a year ago. We got it implemented probably more like 6 months into the fiscal year. By the time we got it staffed up and we had our various revenue billing process begin. So maybe the city manager knows exactly when.
Yeah, it was at least midway through the fiscal year, and that also is the subject of a budget response report.
Right.
Sort of what's been the status, what have been the results of that inspection program over the course of the past few months.
I just, and I saw that, and I don't expect you to pull the answer out of your hat now, Joe. Just curious if the 280,000 or the increase that you recognized in there was based on actuals that we've seen so far in the program, or it's based on estimates?
Yeah, we'll have to look at that and include that as part of the budget response report.
Okay. For the city clerk's office, there was a recognition of a reduction. Last year, they had their strike team expenditure.
Right.
And that would have been part of their budget as far as maintenance and operations, or would that have been personnel?
That's in personnel, but it's part-time personnel, so it's a singular line item.
Because we've got a reduction there of $6,000. How much was the strike team allocation?
The reduction of $6,000, I think you're looking at the M&O expense line there. So the part-time staffing would be in the line above it, the personnel line.
Okay. So that's where that was minus $36,000. What was so the whole department is down 41,000. How much was the strike team one-time allocation?
50,000.
50,000, so about where that was.
Yeah.
Okay, great, thank you. I didn't remember what it was, and I was trying to search and couldn't find it. Let's see here. Lagoon. Okay. Well, the maintenance fee that's charged as part of the Tidelands. So what we have in the Tidelands or the waterfront department, there's maintenance and operations is charged in there. In the Tidelands, the leaseholders, as part of in addition to their camp charges, or maybe as part of their camp charges, pay for maintenance on the pier, like steam cleaning the decks and things like that. Is that part of their gross, or is there an ISF charge and that charge within the leases, or is it all together?
Two different things. There is a CAMS charge for different things, sanitation and some other things for their services that accrues as a revenue source for us. But generally, the expense you're seeing is an M&O expense that is a direct labor charge for public works personnel that support common area in the Tidelands. Horseshoe Pier, Sport Fishing Pier, although currently closed, but anything that would be in the Tidelands that would be M&O related, it might be electricity charges, it might be other operations expenses, it might be power washing, whatever is related to that Tidelands activity.
Okay, I promise I'm almost done. So that's, because what I understood is that it was in their leases and it was something, I didn't know if that was the Pier Association and it was part of because they paid it, what I understood is they paid it to the Pier Association.
They might, and the Pier Association also does some other things. They do programs and services and they have some other activities that are separate. But we collect the CAMS charges it becomes basically a revenue source for us to offset those expenses.
Okay. Part of the maintenance and operations that was in the city manager's budget, it was, there was a big reduction there. And the proposed is maintenance and operations, 439,000, and Commissioner Esser pointed out to me then where I'm going to find that, and I'll go to the transparency portal and dig into where that 439,000 for maintenance and operations in the city manager's budget is going. I'll do that offline.
Well, you're not going to be able to find it by department. It's overall maintenance and expenses by
Okay,
type,
can you give me
know.
an example of what that 439
That,
represents?
that's going to largely be, the reduction is going to largely be attributed to carryover, one-time professional services. An example of that, consulting services associated with our enhanced infrastructure financing district efforts, consulting services for other general fund activities that might be unique in nature. So those revenues or funds had been accrued over a few years, were available in the budget, now have been spent down. They're not in our core budget.
So what's the 439 getting spent on?
That's going to be our state and federal lobbyists, as an example. We have a consultant that supports us for various wireless technology review.
Okay.
We have other standardized contracts that are really global, citywide issues.
Contract services.
Yes.
Contract services, supplies, memberships, our membership in the League of California Cities, the COG, SCAG. Our federal lobbyist is $88,000 a year.
Okay.
Our state lobbyist is $47,000 a year.
I just thought, thank you, I think in the
Yeah.
interest of transparency, it's important for
Yeah,
people
and,
to know what that
and these
is.
are pre the decision packages. So if the decision packages associated with the chamber expenses are approved, this will go down further.
Right.
as an
And it's, so there are other contracts that we have, contract services that we have. For example, the payroll contract service here we have as part of a decision package that is a contract service that's as part of a decision package rather than as part of a department maintenance and operations. But our contract with our consultants for lobbying, for example, is not contained within a decision package.
That's a core expense.
It's a core
So if it's in a core
Continues.
expense, it keeps going each year. And there could be examples where we might say, hey, we need $50,000 a year every year to cover whatever this might be. But in the case that you bring up with the payroll tech, because that's a one-year review, one-year trial, one-year agreement, it would be reflected as a one-time expense in M&O versus a carryover.
Whereas not taking into account the SCAG and the membership and the things that Mr. Hefkin mentioned, but for example, a consultant or a lobbyist, those are ongoing relationships, contractual relationships. It's
Exactly.
not an hourly thing, we're simply on retainer to
Multi-year
represent
agreements.
us within the city.
Exactly.
And again, that summary that separates out one-time and ongoing, those ongoing expenses will be built into next year's core budget.
The ongoing.
It's
Okay.
just the one-time that will be taken.
That's why we're careful in the decision package when we describe it. Is it a one-time expenditure appropriation or is it an ongoing appropriation? When you see the words ongoing, that means it will be additive this year and then you won't see it again. It'll be built into core in future years.
Okay, thank you. I'll take a step back and let others ask questions. Thank you.
Commissioner Samples, thank you for being patient.
Thank you for inviting me. I just want to explore one area, and I don't want to pick on one department. It's just that they've made themselves extremely visible in the last year. But I'd like to use it as an example because I'm not finding a lot of detail in the budget, and there are costs in most cities that get buried in other places, not because people are intentionally trying to bury them, but they just kind of migrate into other places. So first I need to ask, for the police department, do they still have a boat?
They do.
Do they still have a drone program?
Yes,
They do.
Do they still have a SWAT program?
yes.
Do they have any other special, well, they've got canines, do they have any other special operations? And the reason I ask is because those operations usually entail some significant incremental costs in terms of personnel, because they tend to be specialty operations. They tend to entail a lot of overtime, because other vacancies have to be filled while those specialty people are training. And I'm not seeing anything in the budget that talks about any of that. Is there a way to explore what those costs are and what value we're really getting? And the main reason I ask is things like, we've heard about the drone program a couple of times. I'm sure they're using the drones pretty frequently, but is it really doing anything for us? The SWAT team, most cities have abandoned their SWAT operations because they tend to do not much more than deliver high-risk warrants, and that can be contracted out. I think there are some areas, and like I said, I'm not trying to pick on the police department. They've just made themselves very visible in the last year with the new Navy and the new Air Force, and I'm a little bit concerned that as we're trying to save money and we're trying to look at ongoing costs, this is creeping in the opposite direction in our most expensive department.
Well, I will say that all of those units that you described are in our core budget, and have been funded and are proposed for continual funding in our core budget. So in terms of identifying the various units, our broader budget does break down by division some of the activities, but you're probably looking even more granular than that. That would take a more subsequent or a more substantive review from the chief. I do know that we have 96 sworn personnel in the department budget. We're asking that 95 of those positions be filled in this fiscal year. We're holding the one vacant. They're assigned, and they evolve and move based on the areas of need in our community. So do we have a unit dedicated solely to SWAT? No. Do we have a SWAT group that's trained and prepared to respond in SWAT-type situations? Yes. But are they doing something else as part of their day job? Yes, probably on patrol or in SIU or something else. So I think it might be helpful if you're curious. I'm sure Keith would be willing to have a chat with you and kind of break down how he deploys his personnel. But from a general standpoint, we have 96 sworn officers in the budget, like I said, 95 being filled, and that really hasn't changed much in the last few years. And some folks will say there was a time this department had 108 sworn personnel. I don't think we'll see those days again. I don't think we can afford that, but we are well below what I understand our department's peak was historically.
Well, I guess two pieces in my response to you. First of all, the last time I was here, you confirmed the fact that there's no incentive for a department head to reduce their budget. And you just said that the reason the budget for the police department is what it is because that's the budget, not that there was any incentive to reduce it. I understand that we have some number of police officers in the department, but when you have special operations like the boats or the drones or SWAT, and SWAT in particular, it usually ends up being a lot of overtime someplace because those guys have to go for training on a regular basis, and it's above and beyond the normal training that they need for their traditional job here in the city. So there's overtime, there are training costs, there are equipment costs, on and on and on that end up getting buried in the budget. And I'm just asking the question, do we need those services? Are they really that vital? Is there some other way to handle it?
Well, and what I would say is that what happened last year as part of the budget, we had the department's heads appearing before the council and essentially answering questions like that and defending their budget, answering questions. We don't have all the department's heads here tonight, and the best person really to answer the specific questions about how the resources are used in the department now would be our police chief. And if that's an interest of the commission, we can bring some of the department heads into your next meeting, or you can, if it's the consensus of the commission that you want to focus on specific areas, you can include that as part of your direction and be reflected in the minutes and signal to the council, hey, we really would like you to look at these 2 or 3 things or however many things there are.
And as Joe mentioned, if you will have your next meeting in June, if we can see if that timing works for the chief, and he could come down here and answer those questions very directly.
I'm open for any thoughts?
Along those lines, I have specific issues within the department. I want to turn everybody to the department budgets and I want to thank you, Marnie, for giving the pro forma actuals that I've been asking for forever, and I really appreciate that you incorporated that and gave that as part of our agenda. So along those lines, I wanted to point out a few things, with the police department as well as the fire and city attorney. Just comparing, the mid-year budget numbers with our estimated actuals, where we think we're going to end the year. And again, clarifying for everybody, we already had this discussion. Mid-year has all the positions filled or filled and unfilled in the budget. Okay, so we're talking about not realizing that those unfilled are in there. And if you notice on the city attorney the police and the fire, if you look at, the actuals are actually overrunning from the budget. Like city attorneys, 43,000 above the budget for the actual. And just trying to understand what's driving that, because, you know, there's obviously no changes in the personnel or anything like that. So all I can guess is that there's something going on there with overtime or something, because, you know, we should have everything in the budget, whether the positions are filled or unfilled. And if you, looking at police, the police are over the budget, 456,000. Fires over 784,000. So my guess is that the overtime is costing us more than actually filling the positions. As you noted in the fire department, there's 8 vacant positions, so I'm assuming overtime's going crazy, you know, compensating for all these vacancies. But, you know, which looks like our costs, obviously the overtime's costing us more than, you know, if we were to fill these positions. So am I assuming correct in that?
Subject to adding the PERS cost for new employees.
Yeah. Yeah, which is all in the budget, right? Should be all in the mid-year budget, but yet our actuals are overrunning it quite significantly.
Yeah, and that could, and without having gone into great detail on those specific questions, and we can come back to you with probably expanded explanation.
Okay.
But it's possible that overtime's a factor. It's also possible that there are grant activities that might be a factor that weren't reflected in mid-year that might have some level of reimbursement associated. There could be a few things. So if those are specific questions you're curious about, we can certainly provide some more detail for you.
Yeah, I think we need to understand that, because these are, you know, these are real costs. I mean, you know, we're supposed to have the budget supposed to be full fronted. You know, we're supposed to have all the increase of the CalPERS, all the benefits in there, all the positions and whatnot in there. So I think it's something we totally have to understand, why our actuals are, you know, with the vacant positions and whatnot, why they're actually running over.
Sure, and again, these are still estimates. I mean, that's the challenge with this, right? It's basically revision on the projection from mid-year. So we're 2 months later into the year. Ideally, it's a more accurate projection than the mid-year was. So there is still some variability in how these estimates are going to be provided department to department. I mean, Marnie's essentially relying on that department's budget expert to drill into the detail and tell us with some level of confidence what we can expect to see over the next 6 weeks as the budget comes to a close in the current fiscal year. So again, they're projections, but if you'd like us to provide a little more detail on the variances for fire, police, and city attorney, we can do that.
And I did get some, I don't know what you'd call them, but forewarning when I got the pro forma numbers was, you know, this is my estimate right now. You know, I'm one injury away from that number being totally off. And so it is very much just an estimate at a point in time.
And we do, in the case of police at least, have an overhire program. I mean, by design, we have been, in order to try to staff up, you recall, it was years, we were looking at 82, 84 actual sworn personnel, while our full complement was 12, 14 positions more than that. So over the last few years, we've deployed an overhire effort that's actually encouraged more people to cycle through on a recruitment basis, and we have expenses associated with that. People come through the academy, they start on field training, and they might fall out. Those expenses are reflected. So with that overhire program, that may be in part what we're seeing in police. I think fire very well could be overtime related, given the fact that we do have the 6 to 8 vacancies over the course of the fiscal year. But yeah, we can get you some more information on that.
Right, and to my point is what I'm trying to make is that, you know, this budget's tight. Our expenses our revenues are flat. We've got to look at controlling these costs. And so how can we, you know, if it is in fact overtime that's allowing us to to overrun our budget, constantly here. Those kind of things like efficiencies, or, maybe we need to really be more proactive in filling these vacant positions. I mean, I'm sure they are, but you know what I'm saying? I mean, it's something that needs to be really looked at, because it looks to me that the overtime is really costing us a whole lot here.
And out of fairness, I'm just thinking about this. You'll recall, this was the first year, because largely we are running tight, we wanted to be as accurate as we could, we adjusted personnel down in some of these departments to reflect projected savings at the end of the fiscal year, so we didn't have to pull from reserve in order to balance. What might be helpful, at least in these three categories, is if we look at what was the adopted 17-18 year budget, because I would imagine the adopted fire budget is actually, while it might have been adjusted at mid-year downward because there was some projected savings, my guess is it's higher than the $16 million projected actual now. Same goes, I would expect for police, that the number is higher than the mid-year number, because I believe part of our mid-year balancing was anticipating some level of salary savings in various departments. So don't know if that explains the city attorney's situation, but I do believe if you look at a